Thank you very much for your warm welcome. And I must say that I am so impressed with the Niagara Foundation and the work that you're doing and bringing people together. And this is an important forum, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And I also appreciate the introduction. It's a lot of awards this year. It's been a remarkable year for me. But what that really represents is the work of Chicago United and the members who allow me to do that work. Social justice, access to opportunity, and leadership in breaking down barriers are really the common denominators in all of those accolades. And what it really reveals is that each one of those organizations recognizes that continued advocacy is still important and the issues remain relevant. So, as I said, it's a really special pleasure to be with you today because this forum, the Niagara Foundation, provides a unique opportunity to explore the dynamic discussion of income and economic disparity. And it's really a perfect time to have this discussion because it's been in the headlines almost on a daily basis. When I suggested the title for the program much earlier in the year, The Widening Racial Disparity in Chicago's Corporate Response, I really could not have imagined the backdrop of the Occupy movement. And so whatever you think of the tactics, the dissonance or the cohesion of that movement, I think there's a central theme that we can pull out, and it has meaning in the context of our discussion today. The movement, from my perspective, highlights that the United States is deeply committed to principles. Out of our historical rejection of royalty, we believe that everyone, not just the rich, should have the opportunity to get ahead and lead a good life. Pretty simple stuff. We believe that everyone should have the right to be heard when our country makes decisions about our future. And we believe that everyone, not just the rich, should have the opportunity to participate fully and meaningfully in society. And yet, in many ways, our nation's been shaped by the tension between principles and practice. And there's always been movements to address these tensions. And some have led to really dramatic reform. So if you think about it, in the history of our country, we've ended slavery. We extended the franchise to women. And we've secured basic civil rights to all. In some ways, some of these projects still remain incomplete and they're ongoing. We're always continuing to make progress. But in each case, what we're doing is we're defining the best of our country by our commitment to making our most cherished principles real and meaningful. So for Chicago United and for me personally, the mission to ensure parity of economic opportunity for people of color remains deeply embedded in our principles. And it's really clear to me also that there's much work to be done. So first, let me give you a little bit of an overview of Chicago United. Our founding is rooted in the corporate community's response to the riots following Dr. King's assassination. And it was obvious then that communities would self-destruct if they didn't have a chance to reach economic parity through jobs, better education, and business development. At that time, 1968, Chicago's corporate CEOs recognized the responsibility to engage directly with community and business leaders in the Black community to drive change. Today, the CEOs from major corporations still sit at the table with Chicago United, and they sit with their counterparts from the minority business community in order to build bridges to economic parity throughout Chicago. And we do this at Chicago United with a very, very sharp focus on multiracial leadership in 3 areas. Corporate governance, so who's sitting on the boards of directors of Chicago's corporations, greater inclusion in the C-suites and who's moving into the C-suites, who's in that pipeline, and more diverse business partnerships. So building real strong relationships with minority businesses. So that's kind of the backdrop of what Chicago, that's a really short version of what we do at Chicago United, but that gives you a little bit of a sense of it. So if we come back to our theme of the widening racial disparity in Chicago's corporate response, for me, I thought I really need to understand what's going on in this backdrop of the Occupy movement. You know, who are the 1% that the 99%, you know, they're out there saying we're the 99%. So who are the 1%? And what do they look like? So for those of you who already know this information, you'll bear with me, but I had to really give myself a reference point, so I thought I'd bring you with me. If we start with income, if you're at the entry point of that 1%, so if you're at the 99th percentile, your annual earnings are about $506,000 per year. So, and that's according to the analysis done by the Tax Policy Center. But if you're at the 99.5 percentile, your income rises to $815,000 annually. If you're at that 99.9% in that top percentile, your earnings are now at about $2,075,000 per year. So annually, the top 1% in this country earn about a fifth of the country's entire income. But income inequality isn't only about the annual earnings. It's about accumulated wealth. So its inequality actually is far greater when you include wealth. And that's going to be really important when I start thinking about racial inequalities as well. The top 1% of Americans by net worth hold about a third of American wealth. So the 99th percentile, and I know this is a lot of statistics, but I think it's really important. The 99th percentile average net worth was approximately $19 million in 2007. So that's when the data was available to us. And for the next 9%, so first the top 1% and the next 9%, the average net worth was about $2.3 million. So I want to be fair because in that 99%, if you look at that 9%, there are millionaires. So to be fair, there's a lot of millionaires in that 99%. But still, we know that that's a very stratified level. So, from my perspective, what about race when we have this discussion about disparity? And what about race when it comes to the Occupy movement? Well, in many ways, it's an age-old debate in the United States. What's the significance in terms of inequality? Is it race or is it class that drives that? And the Occupy movement is focused on gross economic inequality in the United States. But from my perspective, we can't ignore the relationship between color and membership in the 99%. Statistically, blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans are far more likely to be concentrated and confronted by obstacles that they face at the bottom of that 99%. And in many ways, I think class-centered debates tend to be more palatable in the United States than race-centered debates. We don't seem to tense up as much when we talk about class as we do about race. But the reality is that inequality in and of itself isn't going to be reduced by changes in economic practices alone if we ignore the effects of racism. The growth of the middle class after World War II owed a lot to the establishment of the Federal Housing Authority in 1934 and to the entitlements that were offered by the GI Bill, including access to higher education. But these government programs were not really race neutral. We'd like to think about them as being race neutral, but they really weren't, not in their effects, because racism encouraged neighborhood redlining, and that limited access to home mortgages for blacks and Latinos. University segregation actually prevented many of the blacks and Latinos returning home from obtaining their higher education. And discriminatory mortgage practices at the time prevented people of color from developing the assets that many others developed through home ownership. And all of these factors over time created a significant wealth gap. Blacks and Latinos did eventually gain access to greater home ownership, but most recently, it often came at the price of predatory home loans that inflated the housing bubble, which we've all read about. But what we saw with the burst of that bubble and then the ensuing recession, that aggregate wealth actually plummeted in communities of color. So today, the median wealth of whites is now 20 times that of African Americans and 18 times that of Hispanic households. And that's according to very recent research that was released from the Pew Research Center. And they used, obviously, government data to drive that research. Unemployment rates for African Americans and Hispanics remain much higher than that of whites. And the lopsided wealth ratios are actually now the largest since the government began publishing that data, and that was a quarter of a century ago. It roughly twice the size of the ratios that had been kind of prevalent between these groups for the last 2 decades. So what you'll see now is that when you look at wealth, and when I talk about wealth, I'm not talking about becoming part of the 1%. I'm really talking about what's the difference between what you own and what you owe, right? That's really the measure of wealth. But when you look at that and how important that is to the average person, that wealth is what you use to start a business, to buy your home, to send your kids to college, to ensure a retirement. So that little gap between what you own and what you owe is really important to everyone, to the general population. And in particular, without wealth, families and communities cannot become and remain economically secure. And boy, we're seeing that in Detroit today. You know, how important having some savings is. So we refer to the wealth disparities in addition to employment disparities. The Pew Research analysis finds that in percentage terms, the bursting of the housing bubble in 2006 and the recession that followed from late 2007 to 2009 took a far greater toll on the wealth of minorities than on whites. So from 2005 to 2009, so inflation-adjusted median wealth fell by 66% among Hispanic households and 53% among black households, compared with just 16% among white households. It's huge. 66% decline in wealth for Latinos, 53% for blacks, 16% for whites. So while the recession has hurt everybody, and there's no question about that, when you look at that kind of disparity, it is almost staggering. So as a result of those declines, the typical black household had just $5,677 in accumulated wealth. The typical Hispanic household in 2009 had $6,325 in accumulated wealth. And the typical white household had $113,149 in accumulated wealth. So when we talk about those racial disparities, we really cannot ignore what that means when you start looking at communities around the city, communities around the country. So with all of this information, with all of the data that I've just given to you, and I know it was a big, it's like drinking out of a fire hose, but with all this information, we kind of have to ask, is this just a particular moment in time where the recession has kind of exacerbated this disparity, or is this more longitudinal? Are we looking at something just today? Or are we looking at something that's having long-term effects? And to respond to this question, we can look to the research reported by Brandeis University's Heller School for Social Policy. The research there revealed that the wealth gap between white and African American families has more than quadrupled over the course of one generation. More than quadrupled. Using economic data collected from the same set of families from 1984 to 2007, the study found that real wealth gains and losses of families over that time demonstrated, in their words, I'll quote them because, a stampede toward an escalating racial wealth gap in just one generation. From Chicago United's perspective, we also produce primary research. We focus on the corporate community, but we produce primary research. And our research lends credence to the long-term and short-term disparities indicated in this other research. In our most recent corporate diversity profile, we showed that the recession dealt a blow to the efforts of Chicago's corporations to diversify their pipeline of executives of color. So as, jobs were reduced, we actually saw that the layoffs kind of disproportionately affected people of color. The survey, Chicago United's Corporate Diversity Profile, goes on to indicate that prior to the economic downturn, there appeared to be some progress in employment opportunities for the hiring of diverse candidates. However, many of those economic gains were erased during the downturn. In some ways, when I talk with people, very often they'll say, well, it depends on your educational level. In fact, there's a pretty widely held belief that unemployment in minority communities is directly correlated to educational attainment or lack thereof. In fact, as I was listening to CNN, I heard Herman Cain talk in the CNN State of the Union program that they put together, and he said, educational disparity and geographical separation were really the causes of high unemployment rates among African Americans. And I knew that the Chicago United research just didn't bear that out. So as I listened to him, I thought, I really have to make sure I make a point of this, because we work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago to produce some of the research for our Chicago profile. And when the recession started, we asked them to look at what was going on. So this was 2009, at the end of 2009. And they were able to pull for us Bureau of Labor statistics. And so the Fed economists looked into the recession at 2007, early in 2007, before the recession fully hit, and then well into 2009 after we've seen the effects of the recession. And what we saw was that African Americans and Latinos were almost always twice as likely to be unemployed as their white counterparts. And that was regardless of educational attainment. So whether or not you were talking about an African American with a high school degree and a Caucasian with a high school degree, or an African American with a PhD and a Caucasian with a PhD, the African American was almost always twice as likely to be unemployed. So So certainly I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be a well-educated society. Clearly there is importance to that. But we can't deny the fact that something else is going on when you look at equal educational attainments and a great disparity of employment opportunities. When I was kind of thinking about this, I read an article by Prudence Carter, who is a professor at Stanford University, and her words really resonated with me. I didn't think I could say it any better, so I'm going to read you what she said. With President Obama in the White House, many Americans believe that race no longer matters. But of course it does. We have not addressed how our society's economic and educational disparities are so highly correlated with skin color and ethnicity. Racism, both past and present, compounds economic problems for people of color, for whom the enduring effects of racial inequality close access to the middle class, let alone the top 1%. By being color mute, the Occupy movement will only encourage our nation's continuous, dangerous denial of race-based inequality. So for me, that was a pretty sobering statement. It will require our continued diligence to begin to reverse the trends that are decades in the making. But that sounds really all very dim and like there's no answers. And I don't believe that. I think there's a lot that we can do. In fact, I see measurable, meaningful progress taking place right here in Chicago. And some of that progress is being made by the commitments that are being made in boardrooms and C-suites around this city. It's true that unemployment rates run several percentage points higher among blacks and Latinos in comparison to the Caucasian counterparts. But that just means that we should take action. So among the substantial responses that I see from the corporate community in Chicago is something that came out of our members, Chicago United's 5 Forward initiative. It's a regional economic growth plan for the Chicago area. So let me explain the 5 Forward initiative. It enlists the commitment of CEOs of mid to large size corporations in the Chicago metropolitan area to expand relationships or establish new relationships with 5 local minority firms. These minority firms then have the ability to expand their own capacity, to be more competitive, to do business on a regional and national basis. And so you might ask, why would these CEOs make that kind of commitment to do business with local minority firms? Because, they're the stakeholders in this regional economy as well. They've made major commitments here, and they really do realize that having a strong minority business community actually benefits all the stakeholders across the region. So what we see with the 5 Forward program is that corporate spending with local MBEs is creating jobs. Currently, there are 26 corporate partners in the 5 Forward program, and those range from corporations like McDonald's and Baxter International and Kraft to more local participants like University of Chicago or Mesirow Financial. And what we're seeing is that their commitments are meeting results. Right now, there are about 80 minority businesses who have been partnered with these 26 corporations. And some of them are new entrants in that 26 number, so they're still selecting their firms. But the 80 minority firms are currently employing about 4,000 people. That's real jobs in the Chicago market. So for example, Kano Containers in Aurora just added a second shift in a facility that's doubled in size since they became a 5 Forward partner. RT Beverages, a beverage vending machine company and a coffee service, is a vendor to Advocate Healthcare. Not only have they increased their revenue and created new jobs, but Advocate has been such a good partner with them, they've actually helped improve their processes. So sustainably increasing their capacity. Their Advocate's finance department actually helped to shift their billing processes and their collection processes so that it's increased their cash flow. When we talked about the corporate diversity profile, which is a longitudinal study, that profile also expanded some corrective actions. And so I want to make sure to talk about the return on investment on diversity and inclusion and the companies who have committed to using diverse slates of candidates and recruiting and promoting individuals. Sometimes when corporations look at where they want to expand diversity and inclusion, they'll look at their very high ranks and they'll look at things that are preventing them from doing that. And I thought Ernst & Young and the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago are taking some really innovative action in that arena. They're actually looking at unconscious bias and helping their senior executives understand unconscious bias so that when they're slating candidates, when they're identifying leaders, when they're looking to expand their top level ranks, that they're really understanding themselves better so that they can understand the people who potentially could become leaders. And that is a really significant way to advance opportunities, broaden opportunities. But there are other ways that people are affecting diversity and inclusion and affecting communities beyond their corporate walls. And I want to give you one example because I think it's kind of compelling. McDonald's has a program called English Under the Arches. They're in their first pilot year of this program. And as you probably know, McDonald's has been widely recognized as one of the best places for minorities to work. They've pioneered a lot of programs. But one of the things that they pride themselves on is finding ways to drive opportunities from the crew level to the C-suite. And English Under the Arches is one of those initiatives. It's a 22-week program for high-potential, first-level restaurant managers who have limited proficiency in English. So if you think about the fact that roughly 70% of McDonald's managers start as basic crew members, they have a pretty good track record of bringing people up through their ranks and building executives from their ranks. So on a day-to-day basis, you think about those first-line managers, they're the people who are running the restaurants every day. Those are the people that you see, kind of directing the crew members. And it can be a real launching pad for a long-term career. And a lot of you probably know that Jim Skinner, who is the CEO of McDonald's now, started as a crew member. So it's possible. You can actually hit the C-suite. Well, what McDonald's did was they identified that there was a gap. They were bringing in a lot of crew members that were Latinos with limited English proficiency. But these people were really skilled in operations. They were good leaders. And they recognized that as leaders, they couldn't get much farther without strong English proficiency. So what they've done is they found a way to leverage that talent. And this is where you really start to see how corporations can make a difference in closing those ranks of disparity. Because if you can recognize talent, you can develop talent. You can give people the opportunities to increase their family's wealth, I should say. So in this pilot year, McDonald's has taken 1,800 of these first-level managers through an English proficiency program. That, I think, is really meaningful. And we know that this is probably enlightened self-interest on the part of McDonald's. You know, they need managers. There's nothing wrong with enlightened self-interest, because I mean, we all have it, right? We all want things for our families. We want good things, but we want to do good things for society too. There's nothing really wrong with that. But if you think about what that means, 1,800 first-line managers who have now increased their English proficiency, it now opens opportunities for them, not only at McDonald's, but if they move out of McDonald's to other places where they can become managers. And what that means for their families, for 1,800 families across the country, is now they have an opportunity to accelerate their life skills. And that's going to enhance their economic security. So what I see is when people understand where those gaps lie, when we look at those statistics, when we look at what that means, individual companies, individual organizations can take action. We're not going to be able, there's no magic bullet that's going to solve this. It really means that we find those opportunities and we act on them. McDonald's happened to take that one step. I think it's meaningful. But as each one of us goes through our lives, and we, in our individual activities, understand where those disparities are, we can start to find ways to address them. And so, I look at lots of opportunities, and I look at people like, it comes from senior leadership. They've got to get it. They've got to see it. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois Healthcare Service Corporation has a new CEO for the last couple of years, Pat Hemingway Hall. She sees disparity in healthcare. For her, that's in her wheelhouse. She can have an impact, and she's committed to that. So each one of us, I think, can make a commitment in our wheelhouse, and that's what it will take. So I really appreciate the companies who have joined me in this journey towards understanding and addressing these disparities. They've gone on to open doors and open minds and open opportunities, and I continue to invite other companies to join us. And I think those of us who are very engaged in this work really see the benefits of engaging in creating new opportunities. It's an investment in our future, and it's one that I believe in strongly. And I also appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. So thank you very much. Where I'm troubled is when taxpayers, and this is my personal opinion, not that of Chicago United members, I'm going to disclaim. Where I get troubled is when taxpayers are expected to support issues that bring profitability to corporations, but we don't see the benefit back to the individual taxpayers. So for me, that feels a little bit like socializing the debt, but profits, are all operating in the capitalist system, and so that's my personal perspective on it. I am troubled sometimes when the general taxpayer is asked to essentially benefit the profitability of the corporation. The corporations, are clearly not here to be engines of social change. That's not their role in society, nor do I expect them to be that. But what we have found is that those corporations who are socially responsible tend to do better. Yeah, it's very clear that Latinos are underrepresented in a number of sectors, not only in the public sector, but you're absolutely right. And I'm sure that there's some historical reasons why that disparity exists. Part of it has to do with the influx of Latinos. So we know, and you probably know this better than I, that the city of Chicago's population would have declined had it not been for the growth of the Latino population. So in some ways, there's some new entrants into the workforce, and we're going to have to better integrate those new entrants into the workforce, not only in public sector work, but in private sector work. From a political perspective, Latinos have been underrepresented in Illinois politics in a very dramatic way. So those who have been responsible for hiring may not have been as sensitive to Latino style of leadership. And so when I talk about the unconscious bias and where that plays out, if you can't recognize leaders who don't look like you, it's a very human thing. We like to work with people that we understand, that we know and we like and we get them. Doesn't make us bad, it's just how we are built as people. We like people who are familiar and who we understand. It takes a lot of work to overcome that and say, what's my worldview? How do I see leadership? What does leadership look like to me? And when do I not get it? And so up until now, there really hasn't been a way for most people to even get at the fact that they may not be very inclusive when they're selecting leaders. And so we're going to have to do a lot better job for Latinos, frankly, in the state of Illinois, to bring a little more parity to the economic opportunity. There's no question about it. I think we have some legislators now in the Latino caucus who have clearly taken that on as a mission, who have clearly taken that on not only in the employment area but in the contracting area. They've got a lot of work in front of them. But what you've identified as an issue is a real issue. And in order to address it, we've got to have some systemic methods at getting to change.
So Latina, can you speak to how common impact gender on racial disparities?
Well, there's no question that Latinas are particularly hard hit in terms of income disparity. When I look at the senior level ranks of Chicago's corporations, and people ask me to identify Latinas in the senior level ranks of Chicago's corporations, it's hard. It's really hard. I can probably count them on one hand. And when you start to know who they are by name, there's not enough. That's the reality. So I don't have, at the top of my head, I don't know the statistics. But when I look at our corporate diversity profile and where Latinos fall in managers' positions up to the C-suite, unbelievably, woefully underrepresented. But what I would say about that is, at the same time, you're seeing Latinas start businesses at 6 times the rate of their white counterparts. And I think part of that is that there is a style of Latina leadership that says, I need to support my family, I can work hard, I know what to do, I know where I've got a skill, and I'm going to start a business. And that tends to be where Latinas are now starting to lead, is in their own businesses. The challenge there is the one that I've identified with 5 Forward, and that is we have a lot of Latinas starting small businesses, but they're essentially self-employed, and they don't have a business model that's going to build scale. And so that becomes a problem, because then they don't have long-term benefits. They're not building their retirement. They're not building wealth. They're staying employed because they're self-employed, but they're not really building significant wealth. And so we've got to perhaps as Latinas take a step back and understand what entrepreneurship is about versus self-employment. And we need to accelerate the educational opportunities and the revenue opportunities.
Despite gas sector expertise, do you see similarity among Latinas?
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. But the opportunities for African American women in corporate America have been stronger. And that may just be historically, if you look at the diversity efforts, African Americans led the way. So naturally, they were in the leadership positions and should have been in those leadership positions because they were breaking new ground. And so, we've got some time gaps. And so they've had some opportunities, and I can identify, just completely from a very personal perspective, I can identify far more African American women leaders than Latina leaders. That said, let me say something again from my personal experience. I owned a company, a family-owned business with my mom. Had it not been for the African American women who were in those leadership positions, our business would never have grown the way it did, because they understood the difficulty, they understood the struggle, and they actually were for a Latino-owned business, they were our greatest advocates. And so I'm one of those people who really believes in partnering across lines. I think when we start to say Latinas need this, Blacks need this, when we don't see the value of partnering across lines, we're missing the boat. And my personal experience has been one of, I would never have reached this level of success had it not been for the support of African American women. I mean, the short answer is yes. We certainly are seeing that companies understand the value of diversity. They understand it from a lot of different perspectives. They understand it from the perspective of markets, that the markets that they serve are diverse, and so it's valuable to have people in their staff that understand the diverse markets. And they understand that from an innovation standpoint, when you have lots of different points of view, you're going to tend to have greater innovation. So from that perspective, yes, I'm heartened by that. And at the same time, what I have not yet seen, and maybe it's a matter of timing, but longitudinally we haven't seen it yet, that companies are very good at hiring across the workforce, entry level, in a very diverse manner. But when it comes to promoting, the higher you go in the corporation, the more homogeneous it becomes. And so I have to ask, when corporations hire people, they think all the people have the potential to be successful, right? You're not going to hire somebody that you think is not going to be successful. So when they hire all these folks, they're thinking everybody has a chance to be successful. So what is it inside of the company that prevents some folks from moving up and other folks from they're clearly on the path? And that's where we need to get at, really understanding the bias. And where I see that getting stuck is not at the CEO level. The CEO gets it. But once you get into middle management, and I'm saying, okay, I've got to determine who I'm going to mentor, who I'm going to promote, how do I help this person get ahead, I have a tendency to do more of who looks like me, who gets it, who am I comfortable with. And that's the part where I am still not quite as sanguine about the prospects. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm so incredibly impressed with the mission of Niagara Foundation, and bringing people together for cross-cultural learning is critically important for the Chicago arena. I mean, if you think about Chicago and how diverse the populations are, the more we come together, the better off we all are. So I'm incredibly impressed by the mission.